Welcome to Ancient Relics Keeper. Uncover hidden histories, lost artifacts, and ancient mysteries. Join us as we explore the past secrets. Subscribe and dive into history's untold stories. In 1978, the Catholic world rejoiced at the election of Pope John Paul I, a humble and kind man known as the Smiling Pope. But just 33 days later, he was found dead in his bed. The Vatican quickly declared it a heart attack and refused an autopsy. This official story has been questioned ever since, giving rise to dark theories of a murder plot at the very heart of the Holy See. In the long, often turbulent, and richly storied history of the papacy, an institution that measures time in millennia, there are certain years that stand out, etched into memory for their drama, their upheaval, and their profound sense of mystery. The year 1978 was one such year. It would become known to historians and the world alike as the Year of Three Popes, a breathtakingly brief and chaotic period of sudden death and historic transition that would shake the foundations of the Roman Catholic Church and give birth to one of its most enduring and unsettling modern mysteries. It is a story that begins with a moment of great, unexpected joy and hope, a story centered on a man whose humble charm and infectious, radiant smile seemed poised to change the very culture of the Vatican forever. But his story would end just as suddenly, in an abrupt and confounding tragedy, leaving behind a tangled trail of unanswered questions, contradictory official statements, and a perfect, silent vacuum in which the darkest and most sinister suspicions could grow. To truly understand the conspiracy, we must first understand the official story as it was presented to the world, and then, piece by piece, we must carefully and critically examine the cracks that began to appear in its carefully constructed facade almost from the moment it was told. Our story begins in the sweltering heat of August 1978. Pope Paul VI, a thoughtful, intellectual, but often tormented figure who had reigned for 15 difficult years, had just died. The cardinals of the Catholic Church, princes of the Church from every corner of the globe, gathered in Rome for a papal conclave, the secret, ancient, and deeply sacred ritual to elect a new successor to St. Peter. The eyes of the world turned to Vatican City. The global press corps descended on Rome, and hundreds of thousands of the faithful gathered in St. Peter's Square, their gazes fixed on the small chimney atop the Sistine Chapel, waiting for the puff of smoke that would signal their choice. Inside, the cardinals were reportedly deeply divided. There were powerful conservatives from the Roman Curia, the Vatican's central bureaucracy, who wanted to halt what they saw as the dangerous liberalizing trends in the Church. And there were powerful progressives, many from outside Italy, who wanted to champion and continue the modernizing spirit of the Second Vatican Council. After 4 ballots, in what would be one of the shortest conclaves of the 20th century, a compromise candidate, a man acceptable to both sides, emerged. On August 26th, white smoke billowed from the chimney. The great bells of St. Peter's pealed, and the name announced from the central balcony to the cheering crowds was a surprise to almost everyone: Albino Luciani, the Patriarch of Venice. The choice was, in many ways, astonishing. Luciani was not a powerful Vatican insider, a curialista who had spent his life expertly navigating the complex and often treacherous political corridors of the Holy See. He was, in every sense, a humble pastor. He was the son of a poor bricklayer and socialist from the rugged Dolomite Mountains of northern Italy. He was known for his profound humility, his gentle and approachable demeanor, his deep pastoral concern for the poor and the working class, and, above all, his radiant, ever-present, and completely genuine smile. He was so renowned for his cheerful and optimistic disposition that he was widely and affectionately known by the Italian press as Il Papa del Sorriso, the Smiling Pope. His election was seen by many as a revolutionary breath of fresh air, a decisive rejection of the cold, aristocratic, and political machinations of the Vatican in favor of a man who embodied the simple, compassionate, pastoral heart of the Christian faith. He chose the papal name John Paul I, a historic and deeply significant decision. It was the very first double name in the long history of the papacy. It was a clear and intentional gesture meant to signal his desire to combine the progressive, ecumenical vision of his beloved predecessor, Pope John XXII, with the more traditional, cautious continuity of Pope Paul VI. He wanted to be a bridge, a unifier. And from his very first moments as Pope, he signaled a clear desire for change, a decisive move towards a simpler, less monarchical, and more servant-like papacy. He famously dispensed with the traditional, elaborate papal coronation with its bejeweled, triple-tiered crown, opting instead for a more modest, solemn mass for the inauguration of the pontificate. He was the first pope in centuries to refuse the sedia gestatoria, the ornate, portable throne on which popes were traditionally carried aloft above the crowds like ancient emperors. He relented only when his aides convinced him that using it was the only way for the vast crowds in St. Peter's Square to actually see him. In his public audiences and addresses, he spoke with a simple, direct, and often touchingly humorous style that completely charmed the public and unnerved some of the more staid and formal members of the Vatican Curia. He spoke of the Church as a mother and a servant, emphasizing God's infinite love and mercy over the rigid enforcement of doctrine. The world was utterly captivated. It seemed that in Pope John Paul I, the Church had finally found a leader who could reconnect it with the common people, a man whose genuine warmth and humility could melt the cold, imposing marble walls of the Vatican. His papacy began with this immense and unprecedented wave of global goodwill and hope. But it was destined to be one of the shortest and most fleeting in the long history of the Church. A papacy of just 33 days. On the morning of September 29, 1978, the world awoke to stunning and tragic news. The Vatican officially announced that Pope John Paul I, the smiling Pope, was dead. He had been found lifeless in his bed in the Apostolic Palace. The suddenness of his death, after just over a month in office, sent a shockwave of grief, disbelief, and confusion across the globe. How could this seemingly vibrant, beloved figure, who was only 65 years old, be gone so soon? The world turned to the Vatican for answers, and the official narrative it provided, a story designed to be reassuring and final, would instead become the source of all the controversy, suspicion, and dark speculation that followed. The Vatican's initial account of the Pope's death, released through its press office and the official Vatican radio, was meticulously crafted to paint a picture of a peaceful, serene, and entirely natural end. The official statement laid out a clear and seemingly straightforward timeline of events. On the evening of September 28th, the Pope had followed his usual routine. He had eaten his dinner and had reportedly complained of feeling a slight pain in his chest, a pain which he and those around him dismissed as being related to the heavy pressures and immense workload of his new office. He retired to his bed around 9:30 p.m. The next morning, as was his daily custom, a nun was to place a cup of his morning coffee on a small stool outside his bedroom door at 5:30 a.m. When the Pope failed to emerge after a considerable time, one of his priest secretaries, an Irishman named Father John McGee, became concerned. According to this first, explicit, official version of the story, it was Father McGee who, after knocking and receiving no response, entered the papal bedchamber at around 5:30 a.m. and made the tragic discovery. He found the Pope sitting up in bed, propped up by his pillows, with the reading light still on. He was wearing his glasses, and in his hands, he held a copy of a classic 15th-century devotional text, The Imitation of Christ. He appeared, the Vatican said in its communiqué, to have been peacefully reading at the moment of his death. A serene, gentle smile was said to be on his face, a final testament to his famously cheerful nature. The Pope's personal physician, Dr. Renato Buzzanetti, was immediately summoned. After a brief examination of the body, he determined that the cause of death was an acute myocardial infarction, a sudden, massive heart attack which had likely occurred without a struggle around 11 p.m. the previous night. To bolster this conclusion, the Vatican also made a point of stating to the press that the Pope had a history of poor health and a weak heart, suggesting that while his death was sudden, it was not entirely unexpected from a medical standpoint. To conclude their official narrative, and to close the book on the matter, the Vatican made a critical and ultimately fateful announcement. There would be no autopsy. The reason given to the public was twofold. Firstly, they claimed it was against long-standing papal tradition to perform an autopsy on the body of a supreme pontiff. Secondly, the examining physicians were completely certain that the death was from natural causes and had found no signs whatsoever of foul play or anything untoward. An autopsy was therefore deemed both disrespectful and medically unnecessary. The official story was complete, neat, and tidy. The beloved, smiling Pope had died peacefully in his sleep from a heart attack, a tragic but natural end for a man with a fragile constitution who was simply overwhelmed by the immense burdens of the papacy. It was a faith-affirming narrative designed to bring closure to a grieving world. And it began to fall apart almost immediately. The first and perhaps most significant crack in the official story concerned the crucial and seemingly simple detail of who discovered the body. The Vatican had been very clear and very specific in its initial reports. It was his male secretary, Father John McGee. This was, for the Vatican, an important detail to establish. The papal apartments are a private, almost monastic space. The Pope's bedchamber is considered a sacred and intensely private area. The idea of a woman being the first to enter that space, especially to find the pontiff deceased in his bed, was considered unseemly, improper, and a breach of protocol by the deeply traditional, all-male hierarchy of the Vatican. But the story, as they told it, wasn't true. Journalists, particularly those from the sharp-elbowed Italian press who are more familiar with the day-to-day inner workings of the Vatican, began to hear conflicting rumors from their inside sources. They soon confirmed and began to report that the first person to discover the Pope's body was not Father McGee at all. It was, in fact, a nun named Sister Vincenza Taffarel. Sister Vincenza was one of the small group of devoted nuns who managed the papal household. It had been her long-standing duty, even from his time in Venice, to bring Albino Luciani his morning coffee. On the morning of September 29th, she had placed the coffee on the stool outside his door, as usual. When she returned a short while later and saw that the coffee was still there, untouched, she became worried. Breaking with protocol, she knocked, and receiving no answer, she opened the door and entered the room. It was she who found the Pope dead. It was she who then immediately ran to alert Father McGee, who then came to the room and officially confirmed the discovery. Faced with mounting and specific press inquiries, the Vatican was eventually forced, in a series of confusing and reluctant clarifications, to admit that Sister Vincenza's version of events was, in fact, the correct one. Their explanation for the initial deception was that they had wanted to spare the humble and elderly nun from the intense and overwhelming glare of the global media, and that they had thought it more proper and dignified for the historic discovery to be officially attributed to his male secretary. But this explanation, however plausible from their cloistered and archaic perspective, did immense and irreparable damage to their credibility. If they were willing to lie about a simple, basic, and easily verifiable fact like who found the body, the world began to ask, what else were they lying about? The question hung heavy and poisonous in the air. The deception, meant to protect a delicate sense of propriety, had instead created a powerful and enduring sense of suspicion. It looked less like a harmless white lie and more like the first, clumsy step in a cover-up. The second major crack appeared in the Vatican's carefully constructed claim about the Pope's health. The official line, repeated in numerous statements, was that he had a history of heart problems and was known to be in a fragile physical state. This was a crucial element of their narrative, as it helped to support the conclusion of a natural death from a heart attack. But the Pope's own family, including his brother Eduardo and his niece Pia, vehemently and very publicly contradicted this. They were shocked by these reports. They insisted to the press that Albino Luciani, while not a physically imposing man, had no known history of serious heart trouble. His personal physician from his time in Venice, Dr. Antonio de Ros, who had examined him just before he traveled to Rome for the conclave, also stated that the Pope's heart was in good condition. Yes, he had suffered from some notable ailments in the past, including a serious embolism in his eye in 1975, and he did take medication for low blood pressure, but there was no clinical indication that he was at imminent risk of a massive, fatal heart attack. The family's passionate and public statements directly challenged the Vatican's core justification for the cause of death. If he was in relatively good health, then a sudden, fatal heart attack, while still possible, seemed far less likely and far more suspicious. This discrepancy created another thick layer of doubt. Was the Vatican retroactively creating a medical history for the Pope to make his sudden death seem more plausible? Were they deliberately exaggerating his frailty to quash any uncomfortable questions before they could even be asked? The third, most significant, and for many, the most damning problem with the official story was the Vatican's steadfast refusal to perform an autopsy. The Vatican's claim that autopsies were against inviolable papal tradition was, at best, a misleading half-truth. While it was certainly not common, there was no strict canonical law forbidding it. In fact, historical records show that an autopsy had been performed on at least one previous pope in the 20th century. In a case of such a sudden and unexpected death of a major world leader, a head of state, an autopsy would have been considered mandatory, standard procedure anywhere else in the civilized world. It would have been the one and only way to definitively, scientifically, and transparently establish the cause of death and put all rumors and suspicions to rest, once and for all. The refusal to do so was, to many outside observers, baffling, illogical, and deeply suspicious. If the Vatican was so absolutely certain that he had died of a heart attack, what did they have to fear from a medical procedure that would simply confirm it? Their refusal had the precise opposite of its intended effect. Instead of projecting an image of serene faith, it projected an image of fear. It created a vacuum of certainty, a space that was immediately filled with the darkest and most sinister of speculations. To the outside world, it looked like the Vatican had something to hide. Perhaps they feared an autopsy would reveal an inconvenient and terrible truth that the cause of death was not a heart attack at all. Perhaps it would reveal the presence of a poison, a toxin, or some other unmistakable sign of foul play. Adding to these three major inconsistencies were other strange and contradictory details that emerged in the days and weeks following his death, small pieces of a puzzle that just didn't fit. The Vatican had initially claimed he was found holding a copy of the devotional book, The Imitation of Christ. But other sources, including some who claimed to be close to the papal household, insisted that he was not found with a prayer book, but with a sheaf of official papers in his hand, sermons, speeches, notes, or perhaps, as the conspiracy theories would later allege, a list of crucial appointments and transfers he was planning to make. The image of him dying peacefully with a prayer book was serene, comforting, and theologically neat. The image of him dying while clutching official papers was something else entirely. It suggested he was working on something important, something urgent, right up to the very moment of his death. Furthermore, the two brothers who were summoned to embalm the Pope's body, the Signoraxi brothers, later spoke, anonymously at first, to journalists. They claimed that they had been called in so quickly after the death was discovered, and that the Vatican was in such a hurry, that they had to perform the embalming without all of the Pope's blood having been drained, a highly unusual and professionally questionable procedure. This led to rampant speculation that the Vatican wanted the body embalmed as quickly as humanly possible, perhaps to prevent a proper autopsy from being demanded and performed later, or, more sinisterly, to destroy any potential evidence of toxins or poisons that might have been present in his bloodstream. And then there was the final, confounding matter of the Pope's personal effects, the small, intimate objects of his last moments on earth. His reading glasses, his worn leather slippers, the papers he was holding, and the bottle of medicine he took for his low blood pressure that was on his nightstand. All of these items, which would have been crucial, standard evidence in any formal death investigation, were reportedly removed from his room shortly after his death and subsequently disappeared, never to be seen or accounted for again. The scene of the death had been, in essence, wiped clean. When you assemble all of these disjointed and troubling pieces, the Vatican's official narrative of a simple, natural death begins to look less like a statement of fact and more like a hastily and poorly constructed story, a facade full of holes and deep, structural contradictions. The outright lie about who found the body. the public dispute over his true medical history, the inexplicable and highly suspicious refusal to perform an autopsy, the conflicting reports about what he was holding when he died, and the complete disappearance of his personal effects. Each of these inconsistencies, on its own, might be explainable as a simple error, a misunderstanding, or a clumsy attempt by a secretive, ancient institution to manage a modern public relations crisis. But taken together, they paint a deeply and profoundly disturbing picture. They create a clear and undeniable pattern of deception, misdirection, and obfuscation that strongly suggests the Vatican was not telling the world the full and complete truth about the death of Pope John Paul I. They created the perfect environment for suspicion to fester, a fertile ground in which the seeds of a full-blown murder conspiracy could take root and grow into a dark and menacing forest. The question was no longer if the Vatican was hiding something, but what they were hiding and why. And the terrifying answer to that question, proposed by a new generation of investigators, would lead down a dark rabbit hole of international financial corruption, sinister secret societies, and a rumored papal purge that was stopped, just in time, by a sudden and silent death in the night. The Vatican's official story of Pope John Paul I's death was a narrative riddled with contradictions and shrouded in a fog of secrecy. The changing stories, the disputed medical history, and the baffling refusal to perform an autopsy created a vacuum of truth, a space where suspicion could take root and grow. For any unexplained death, investigators ask two fundamental questions: who had the means and opportunity, and who had a motive? In the closed and guarded world of the Vatican, opportunity would be a matter of inside access. But it was the question of motive that would transform this story from a case of institutional clumsiness into a full-blown conspiracy theory of breathtaking scale. The theory that emerged was not about a personal vendetta or a theological dispute. It was about something far more worldly, far more dangerous, and far more powerful: money. It was a theory that claimed the smiling pope was not a victim of a weak heart, but was the first casualty in a war he was about to declare on a vast and corrupt financial empire operating from within the very heart of the Holy See. To understand this powerful motive, we must delve into the murky and often scandalous world of Vatican finances, specifically the institution known as the Istituto per l'Opera di Religione, the IWAR, more commonly and simply known as the Vatican Bank. The Vatican Bank is not like a regular commercial bank. It is a private, highly secretive financial institution whose stated purpose is to hold and manage assets for religious orders, Catholic charities, and Vatican employees. Because it is located within the sovereign territory of Vatican City, it operates outside the jurisdiction of Italian and international banking regulations. It is accountable only to the Pope. This unique status has, throughout its history, made it a powerful tool, but it has also made it dangerously susceptible to corruption and misuse. And in the 1970s, under the leadership of a powerful and intimidating American archbishop, the Vatican Bank had become entangled in a web of dark dealings that reached the highest levels of international finance and organized crime. The man at the center of this web was Archbishop Paul Marcinkus. Marcinkus was not a typical Vatican cleric. He was a tall, tough, cigar-chomping son of Lithuanian immigrants from Cicero, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago once famous as the headquarters of Al Capone. He was a former bodyguard to Pope Paul VI, a shrewd and pragmatic operator who understood power and was unafraid to use it. As the head of the Vatican Bank from 1971, he ran the institution with an iron fist and an almost complete lack of transparency. Marcinkus believed his primary duty was to make money for the Church, to ensure its financial independence, and he was not particularly scrupulous about how he did it. Under Marcinkus's leadership, the Vatican Bank entered into a close and ultimately catastrophic partnership with one of Italy's largest private banks, Banco Ambrosiano. And the head of Banco Ambrosiano was a man named Roberto Calvi. Calvi was a brilliant but deeply ambitious financier, known in the Italian press as God's banker because of his close ties to the Vatican. Together, Marcinkus and Calvi allegedly used the Vatican Bank's unique offshore status to engage in a massive and complex scheme. They set up a network of phantom shell companies in offshore tax havens like Panama and Luxembourg. The Vatican Bank would issue letters of patronage, essentially vouching for these shell companies, which Calvi would then use to borrow hundreds of millions and eventually billions of dollars from Banco Ambrosiano and other international banks. The money, according to investigators who would later unravel the scandal, was then used for a variety of illicit purposes. It was allegedly used to illegally funnel funds to political parties in Italy, to finance covert anti-communist operations in Latin America, and, most damningly, to launder vast sums of money for the Sicilian mafia. It was a shadow financial empire, a house of cards built on fraud, secrecy, and the unimpeachable reputation of the Holy See. For years, the scheme worked brilliantly. Calvi and Marcinkus grew incredibly powerful, moving billions of dollars around the globe, seemingly beyond the reach of any regulator or law enforcement agency. But by the late 1970s, the house of cards was beginning to tremble. Italian banking authorities were growing suspicious of Banco Ambrosiano's strange and massive debts. Journalists were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. The entire fraudulent enterprise was on the verge of collapse, a collapse that would not only destroy one of Italy's biggest banks, but would also expose the Vatican's deep and damning complicity in one of the biggest financial scandals in modern European history. This was the situation, a ticking time bomb of financial and reputational ruin that Pope John Paul I inherited when he was elected in August of 1978. This leads us to the second crucial pillar of the murder theory, the Pope's planned reforms. Albino Luciani was, by all accounts, a man of simple tastes and deep personal integrity. His entire life as a priest and a bishop had been dedicated to pastoral work, to caring for the poor, and to promoting a vision of the Church that was humble and spiritually focused. He had a deep-seated suspicion of wealth and power. The stories from his time as Patriarch of Venice were legendary. He had once ordered the sale of the diocese's gold to help fund a center for disabled children, declaring that the true treasures of the Church were the poor and the suffering. When this man became pope, he brought that same ethos with him to the Vatican. And according to the central claims of the conspiracy theory, he was utterly horrified by what he began to discover about the institution he now led. In the first few weeks of his papacy, as he began to receive briefings and review the files, he started to uncover the tangled and dirty secrets of the Vatican Bank. He learned of the unorthodox partnership with Roberto Calvi, the vast sums of money being moved through offshore shell companies, and the dark rumors of connections to organized crime. For a man like John Paul I, a man who had preached about a poor church for the poor, this discovery would have been a source of profound spiritual and moral disgust. It was a cancer at the heart of the Holy See, a betrayal of everything he believed the Church should stand for. According to the most detailed and influential version of this theory, laid out by the British investigative journalist David Yallop in his 1984 international bestseller, In God's Name, Pope John Paul I did not just sit on this information. He decided to act, and to act decisively. Yallop, through a network of what he claimed were confidential sources inside and outside the Vatican, pieced together a stunning narrative of the Pope's final days. He claimed that John Paul I, working with a few trusted advisors, began to conduct his own secret investigation. He requested files, he held private meetings, and he slowly put together a picture of the vast network of corruption. And he resolved to clean house. The theory alleges that the Pope compiled a list, a detailed plan for a radical and comprehensive purge of the Vatican's power structure. This was not to be a gentle reshuffling, it was to be a full-scale revolution. The list, according to Yallop, detailed the transfers, the forced retirements, and the outright dismissals of dozens of high-ranking Vatican officials. At the very top of this purge list was Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, the powerful head of the Vatican Bank. He was to be removed from his post and sent to a minor position in America. But the list didn't stop there. It allegedly included other powerful cardinals in the Curia who were complicit in the financial dealings or who were members of a secret and illegal Masonic lodge, known as Propaganda Due, or P2. P2 was a real and deeply sinister organization, a black lodge of Freemasonry that had infiltrated the highest levels of Italian politics, intelligence agencies, and finance. Its membership was a secret list of Italy's elite, and its goal was to create a shadow government. Roberto Calvi, God's banker, was a key member, and it was rumored so were several high-ranking Vatican prelates. John Paul I, according to the theory, saw this entanglement with a secret society as a grave spiritual threat to the Church and was determined to sever all ties. His planned purge was aimed at dismantling this entire corrupt network, a network that connected the Vatican Bank, the Mafia, and the P2 Masonic Lodge. It was a plan of breathtaking audacity, a direct challenge to some of the most powerful and dangerous men in Italy. This brings us to the climax of the conspiracy, the chilling theory of the 33-day plot. The timeline is critical. The theory posits that on the evening of September 28, 1978, the 33rd day of his papacy, Pope John Paul I finalized his revolutionary plan. He had the list of appointments and transfers typed up. He knew exactly who he was going to fire, who he was going to move, and who he was going to promote to replace them. And crucially, he began to put his plan into motion. He allegedly called in certain key figures, including the powerful Vatican Secretary of State, and informed them of the changes that were to be announced the following day. The word was out. The axe was about to fall. This act, according to the theory, was his death warrant. It gave the conspirators a supposed cabal of those who stood to lose everything: Marcinkus and his allies in the bank, the corrupt financiers like Calvi, and their powerful protectors within the P2 lodged both a powerful motive and a final, desperate deadline. They had to act, and they had to act that very night. If they waited until morning, the Pope would make his announcements, the purge would begin, the scandal would be exposed, and their world would come crashing down. Their power, their wealth, and their freedom were all on the line. The theory then outlines a scenario for the perfect murder. The Pope, a man of simple and predictable habits, would be an easy target within the supposedly secure walls of the Apostolic Palace. The conspirators would have had inside help, someone with access to the papal apartments. The method would have to be subtle, something that would mimic a natural death. A fast-acting, difficult-to-trace poison, perhaps a digitalis derivative that would induce a massive heart attack, would be the ideal weapon. It could have been administered in his evening meal, his water, or in the medication he took for his low blood pressure. The Pope would retire to his bed, feeling perhaps a slight discomfort, but nothing to raise the alarm. He would sit up to do some reading, perhaps looking over the very list of changes he was about to make, and then, sometime in the night, the poison would do its work. He would die quietly, seemingly peacefully, in his sleep. The next morning, his body would be discovered. The death would be declared a heart attack, a plausible explanation for a 65-year-old man in a stressful job. And to ensure no uncomfortable questions were asked, no evidence was found, the conspirators would use their immense influence within the Vatican to push for a series of crucial actions: an immediate declaration of death by natural causes, a firm refusal to perform an autopsy, and the swift embalming of the body to destroy any chemical evidence. In this telling, the death of Pope John Paul I was not a tragedy. It was a coup. It was a ruthlessly efficient execution, a preemptive strike to silence a reformer before he could speak. The strange and contradictory actions of the Vatican in the aftermath were not signs of institutional clumsiness. They were the deliberate actions of a successful cover-up. The lie about who found the body was to control the narrative from the very first moment. The insistence on his poor health was to create a pre-existing condition. The refusal of an autopsy was to prevent the discovery of the crime. And the disappearance of his notes and medicine was the cleaning of the crime scene. Every strange detail that created suspicion now clicks into place as a logical step in a meticulously planned conspiracy. The smiling Pope had smiled at the wrong people, had seen the darkness behind their power, and for that, he was silenced. The events that followed in the years after his death only seemed to add fuel to the fire of this theory. The Vatican Bank scandal did eventually explode into public view. In 1982, Banco Ambrosiano collapsed under a mountain of debt, with over $1 billion unaccounted for. Roberto Calvi, God's banker, fled Italy, only to be found a short time later hanging from scaffolding under Blackfriars Bridge in London, his pockets filled with stones and cash, a death that was officially ruled a suicide but had all the hallmarks of a Masonic ritual murder. Archbishop Marcinkus, protected by Vatican sovereignty, was never formally charged but remained a figure of immense controversy until he was finally removed from his post years later. The existence of the P2 Masonic Lodge was also exposed, leading to one of the biggest political scandals in Italian history. The fact that all of this corruption, all of these dark connections that the Pope had allegedly set out to destroy, came to light only after his death, seemed to many to be the ultimate confirmation of the theory. He had been right. The cancer was real, and the people he had supposedly targeted were indeed powerful, ruthless, and capable of murder. His death, in this light, looks less like a coincidence and more like the first domino to fall in a long and bloody saga of power and corruption. It is a story so dark, so cinematic, that it seems almost too incredible to be true. And yet, for millions of people who have looked at the evidence, it is the only explanation that makes sense of the strange and sudden death of a 33-day pope. The theory that Pope John Paul I was murdered is a masterpiece of conspiratorial storytelling. It has all the elements of a classic thriller, a virtuous and naive hero, a cast of shadowy villains, a vast and corrupt financial empire, secret societies, and a perfectly executed crime at the very heart of a powerful, ancient institution. The narrative laid out by investigative authors like David Yallop is so detailed, so internally consistent, and so dramatically satisfying that it feels like it must be the truth. It neatly explains every strange inconsistency surrounding the Pope's death, the changing stories, the missing evidence, the refusal of an autopsy's deliberate steps in a sinister cover-up. For many who have examined the case, the murder plot is not a theory. It is the only logical solution to the puzzle. But a compelling narrative, no matter how convincing it seems, is not the same as historical proof. It is now our duty as investigators to turn the same skeptical eye that we applied to the Vatican's official story onto the conspiracy theory itself. We must ask the hard questions. Is the evidence for a murder plot as solid as it appears? Or is there another, less sensational but perhaps more plausible, explanation for the events of that fateful night in September 1978? This is where our investigation enters its final phase, a phase where we must weigh the counter-theories and confront the profound and lingering questions that keep this mystery alive. The first and most significant challenge to the murder conspiracy is the simple and persistent case for natural causes. While the idea of a cabal of corrupt cardinals and mafiosi poisoning the Pope is undeniably more exciting, many respected historians, journalists, and Vatican insiders who have studied the case have come to a far more mundane conclusion. They argue that while the Vatican's handling of the Pope's death was a public relations disaster, textbook example of institutional ineptitude and obsessive secrecy, was a cover-up not of a crime, but of a simple, tragic, and perhaps slightly embarrassing human reality. Let's re-examine the Pope's health. The conspiracy theory rests heavily on the testimony of the Pope's family, who insisted he was in good health. This is understandable. A family in grief would naturally be shocked by a sudden death and would want to remember their loved one as strong and vital. However, a more objective look at Albino Luciani's medical history paints a more complex picture. He was not a physically robust man. He was 65 years old, and while he had no diagnosed critical heart condition, his health was certainly not perfect. He was known to have very low blood pressure, for which he took medication. He had suffered a serious embolism in his eye several years earlier, an event that indicates potential issues with his circulatory system. He had undergone several operations in his life. And, a fact often overlooked, he had been a heavy smoker for much of his younger life, a major risk factor for cardiovascular disease. Now, place this man, with his less-than-perfect health, into a situation of almost unimaginable stress. In the space of a single day, he was transformed from a relatively quiet patriarch in Venice into the leader of the global Catholic Church, responsible for the spiritual well-being of nearly a billion people. He was handed the keys to one of the most complex and demanding jobs on the planet. He would have been working grueling hours, sleeping poorly, and wrestling with the immense weight of his new responsibilities. For a 65-year-old man, even one in perfect health, the sudden and extreme stress of ascending to the papacy is a significant physiological shock. Medical experts have pointed out that a sudden pulmonary embolism of blood clot traveling to the lungs, which can be related to his previous circulatory issues, is a condition that can cause a sudden, quiet death that closely mimics a heart attack and often leaves very few signs that would be obvious without a full autopsy. A sudden, massive heart attack itself, while perhaps unexpected, is also entirely medically plausible under such circumstances. The argument for natural causes suggests that the Vatican's subsequent actions, while clumsy, were not driven by a sinister conspiracy, but by a deeply ingrained institutional mindset. The initial lie about who found the body, they argue, was exactly what the Vatican claimed it was, a misguided attempt to protect a traditional sense of propriety, to avoid the scandal of a woman being the first to find the pontiff deceased in his bed. It was a foolish and old-fashioned decision, but not necessarily evidence of a murder plot. The insistence on his poor health was likely an attempt to quickly reassure a shocked and grieving Catholic world that his death was from natural causes, an overzealous effort to provide a simple explanation. And the refusal to perform an autopsy, while the most suspicious action, can also be explained by the Vatican's unique culture. It is an institution that sees the Pope not just as a man, but as the vicar of Christ on earth. The idea of subjecting his consecrated body to what they would have seen as a desecrating medical procedure would have been deeply repugnant to many of the traditionalists in the Curia. They would have seen it as a violation of the sanctity of his office. Their decision, in this light, was driven by a misguided sense of piety and a desire to protect the mystical image of the papacy, not to conceal a crime. This brings us to the second major problem with the murder theory: the unreliability of the evidence upon which it is built. The entire, detailed narrative of a financial plot and a planned purge relies almost exclusively on the work of a handful of investigative authors, with David Yallop's In God's Name being the most prominent. Yallop's book is a masterwork of investigative journalism. It is compelling, detailed, and it presents a powerful, coherent case. But a powerful case is not the same as definitive proof. Critics of Yallop's work, including many respected journalists and historians who have covered the Vatican, argue that his book, while a fascinating read, is built on a foundation of circumstantial evidence, anonymous sources, and dramatic leaps of logic. The most crucial piece of evidence in his entire theory is the purge list, the detailed document of transfers and dismissals that the Pope was supposedly holding when he died. But did this list ever actually exist? There is no definitive, independent proof that it did. Yallop's claims about the list and about the Pope's final actions are based on interviews with sources who remained anonymous, moles, inside the Vatican who could not be named. While anonymous sources are a necessary tool in investigative journalism, they are also impossible for outside researchers to verify. We are simply asked to trust that Yallop's sources were real and that they were telling him the truth. The same is true for the claim of poisoning. While it is the heart of the murder plot, there is not a single shred of direct evidence that Pope John Paul I was poisoned. No one has ever come forward to confess. No document has ever been found ordering the act. The theory is based entirely on inference. Because the death was sudden, and because powerful men had a motive, therefore he must have been poisoned. This is a compelling dramatic structure, but it is not historical evidence. It is an assumption, a conclusion reached by connecting a series of circumstantial dots. Without a body to examine, without a toxicological report, the poisoning claim can never be more than just a powerful and unsettling speculation. The sensational connections to shadowy secret societies like the P2 Masonic Lodge and the Mafia also, while adding a thrilling layer to the narrative, are notoriously difficult to prove in a direct, causal way. We know that these organizations were real and powerful. We know that figures like Roberto Calvi were connected to them. But proving that these groups orchestrated a plot to specifically murder the Pope is another matter entirely. It is a world of whispers, rumors, and underworld intelligence, a world where concrete, verifiable evidence is almost impossible to come by. The result is a theory that is incredibly rich in motive and detail, but remarkably thin on the kind of hard, verifiable proof that would be required to solve the case in a court of law or in the court of historical consensus. This leads us to our final and most important point of reflection: the enduring power of the Vatican's own culture of secrecy. Ultimately, the reason this mystery endures, the reason we are still debating it decades later, is not necessarily because there is strong evidence of a murder. It is because the Vatican, through its own actions, created the perfect conditions for conspiracy theory to be born and to flourish. It is an institution that, for centuries, has operated on a principle of need to know, of managing information, and of presenting a carefully controlled, unified front to the outside world. This culture of secrecy is its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. In the case of Pope John Paul I's death, this instinct for secrecy backfired spectacularly. By refusing to be transparent, they created an information vacuum. And as we know, nature and the human imagination abhors a vacuum. Into that empty space flooded a torrent of speculation, rumor, and suspicion. Every clumsy action, every contradictory statement, was no longer seen as a simple mistake, but as a deliberate piece of a sinister puzzle. The refusal to perform an autopsy was the most fatal error. That single decision, likely made out of a mix of tradition and a desire to avoid unseemly procedures, made it impossible to ever know the truth for certain. It permanently locked the door on any definitive medical conclusion, and in doing so, it permanently opened the door to endless speculation. Whether Pope John Paul I was a fearless reformer who was murdered by a cabal of powerful enemies, or simply an unwell man who died at a tragically suspicious time, the Vatican's own actions ensured that his death would be forever shrouded in doubt. They wanted to protect the image of a serene and holy death, but in their attempt to control the narrative, they lost control of it completely. They created a ghost that has haunted the halls of the Apostolic Palace ever since. So where does the truth lie? It is possible that the conspiracy theorists are right. It is possible that Albino Luciani, the smiling pope, stumbled upon a nest of vipers and was silenced before he could expose them. The motive was certainly there. The individuals involved were certainly ruthless enough. And the subsequent scandals that rocked the Vatican Bank proved that the corruption he allegedly sought to fight was very, very real. The theory provides a satisfying, if terrifying, explanation for all the strange events surrounding his death. But it is also entirely possible that the skeptics are right. It is possible that a 65-year-old man with a history of delicate health succumbed to the immense physical and psychological stress of the world's most demanding job. His death, a tragic accident of timing and biology, was then hopelessly mismanaged by a secretive, medieval institution that did not know how to handle a modern crisis. In this version, the only conspiracy was a conspiracy of incompetence, a series of bad decisions that inadvertently created the illusion of a crime. The frustrating and fascinating reality is that, without new evidencia deathbed confession, a long-lost document, a secret diary we will likely never know for certain. The case of Pope John Paul I is destined to remain one of history's great unsolved mysteries. The evidence is too thin to prove a murder, but the circumstances are too suspicious to ever fully accept the official story. He remains frozen in time, the 33-day Pope, his gentle smile now a cryptic symbol. Is it the serene smile of a holy man who died peacefully in his sleep? Or is it the tragic, knowing smile of a martyr, a man who saw the truth and was silenced for it? The Vatican's culture of secrecy has ensured that we can only guess, transforming the legacy of the smiling Pope into one of the most enduring, chilling, and unsettling conspiracy theories in the long and shadowed history of the Holy See. The 33-day pontificate of John Paul I ended as a question mark. Was he a fragile man who succumbed to the immense pressures of his office, his death tragically mismanaged by an institution obsessed with image? Or was he a fearless reformer who stood up to a powerful network of corruption and paid the ultimate price? The Vatican's silence has left the world to wonder, transforming the legacy of the smiling Pope into a chilling Vatican mystery. Thanks for exploring with Ancient Relics Keeper. What mystery should we unravel next? Like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Let's keep digging into history's secrets together. Welcome to Ancient Relics Keeper. Uncover hidden histories, lost artifacts, and ancient mysteries. Join us as we explore the past secrets. Subscribe and dive into history's untold stories. In the year 1900, sponge divers working off the Greek island of Antikythera discovered an ancient Roman shipwreck. Among the marble statues and pottery, they found a strange, corroded lump of bronze. For decades, it was ignored. But when scientists finally looked inside, they discovered something impossible, an intricate system of gears as complex as a 19th-century Swiss clock, an ancient analog computer lost to time. History is full of stories of lost treasures, legends that have captivated the human imagination for centuries. The golden splendor of El Dorado, the sunken Spanish galleons laden with Inca silver, the mythical cities hidden in the dense, impenetrable jungles of the Amazon, the lost and curse-laden tombs of legendary kings. But sometimes, the greatest treasure is not one that glitters. It is not made of gold or jewels. Sometimes, it is a discovery so strange, so unexpected, and so profoundly out of place that it acts like a thunderclap, shaking the very foundations of our understanding of the past. It is a treasure not of material wealth, but of pure, unadulterated knowledge, a single, enigmatic object that can illuminate a lost world of forgotten genius. This is the story of such a treasure, a story that begins not with an ancient, cryptic map or a coded secret, but with the raw fury of Naturia's violent storm, a group of terrified sailors, and a chance discovery in the deep, silent, and unforgiving waters of the Aegean Sea. Our story begins in the vibrant spring of the year 1900. A small, traditional Greek sailing ship, a scaphandro, was making its way through the Aegean. It was a vessel of sponge divers, hardy men from the island of Symi, led by their seasoned captain, Demetrius Contis. Their destination was the rich sponge fields off the coast of North Africa, a long and often perilous journey from their home in the Dodecanese Islands. Their vessel was a creature of the wind, entirely at the mercy of the unpredictable Aegean weather. As they were navigating the narrow but treacherous strait that separates the large island of Crete from the Peloponnesian peninsula of mainland Greece, the sky darkened, and the sea began to churn. A sudden, violent storm, the kind that has sent countless ships to the bottom of these waters since the time of Homer and Odysseus, descended upon them with terrifying speed. With their small ship being tossed by the raging sea, its sails straining against the gale-force winds, Captain Contis made the only decision a prudent sailor could. He sought shelter. He steered his vessel towards the nearest point of land, a small, rocky, and inhospitable island that lay directly in their path. The island was called Antikythera. It is little more than a barren rock, a windswept and lonely outpost in the sea, known more for its treacherous currents than for any welcoming harbor. For the sailors, it was simply a place to drop anchor, to wait out the storm's fury, nothing more. 4 days, the crew waited, their ship moored in a small, relatively protected bay. The men grew restless, confined to their small vessel, watching the gray, angry sea. Finally, as the storm began to subside and the winds began to calm, one of the divers, a man named Elias Stadiatos, decided to pass the time by doing what he did best. He prepared for a dive. He donned his heavy, cumbersome diving suit, a standard, hard hat, rig of the era made of thick canvas and waterproofed rubber. His crewmates lowered the large, spherical bronze helmet over his head and sealed it to the suit. Air would be pumped down to him from the ship through a long, flexible hose. It was a primitive and dangerous technology. He was lowered over the side and began his slow descent into the clear, blue water below, his lead-soled boots thudding onto the seabed. He was not on a mission of discovery. He was simply looking to see if there were any sponges worth harvesting to make up for the lost time. He descended into the silent, otherworldly realm of the deep, walking along the seabed at a depth of about 45 meters, or 150 feet. And then he saw something. It was not what he expected. In the hazy, filtered underwater light, he saw not the familiar landscape of rocks and seaweed, but a grotesque and terrifying sight, what appeared to be a field of rotting human corpses and the decaying, skeletal bodies of horses, scattered across the sea floor. Some were partially buried in the sand, their pale forms looking ghostly and unnatural in the deep. In a surge of pure panic, convinced he had stumbled upon a watery mass grave, he frantically signaled on his lifeline to be pulled to the surface. He broke through the waves, sputtering and terrified, his eyes wide with horror. His crewmates hauled him back on deck, and he ripped off his helmet, telling his captain what he had seen. Captain Contis, a seasoned and skeptical seaman, listened to the panic story and immediately thought the diver was suffering from nitrogen narcosis. This condition, often called the rapture of the deep, is a common affliction for divers working at that depth, where the increased pressure causes the nitrogen in their breathing air to have an intoxicating, hallucinatory effect. Contis didn't believe him. To prove he wasn't crazy, to prove his sanity, Stadiatos insisted on going back down, this time to retrieve a piece of what he had seen as proof. A short time later, he was pulled up again, and this time, he clutched a strange, heavily corroded object in his hand. It was, unmistakably, the bronze arm of a life-size statue. The captain now understood. Stadiatos had not seen corpses. He had, by the purest of chances, stumbled upon an ancient shipwreck. The bodies he had seen were its precious cargo of bronze and marble statues, which, after 2,000 years on the seabed, covered in marine growth and partially buried in the sand, looked exactly like a ghostly army of the dead. They had, by a complete accident of fate, anchored their small ship directly above an undiscovered, ancient treasure. Realizing the immense historical and national importance of their find, Captain Contis made the correct and honorable decision. He left the site undisturbed, marked its location, and, as soon as the weather permitted, he sailed directly to Athens to report the discovery to the Greek authorities. The government in Athens acted with remarkable speed. They immediately recognized the potential significance of the find. With the financial backing of the Greek state and the logistical support of the Greek Navy, they organized what would become the world's first major underwater archaeological expedition. The sponge divers, including Captain Contis and his crew, were hired by the government to conduct the recovery. For the next year, from the autumn of 1900 through the summer of 1901, these brave men undertook a difficult, perilous, and incredibly dangerous recovery operation. The diving technology of the time was, as we've noted, primitive and unforgiving. The divers, in their heavy, clumsy suits, could only stay at the crushing depth of 150 feet for a few precious minutes at a time before they had to begin their slow, staged descent to avoid the bends. The work was grueling. They had to manually dig through the sand and mud on the seabed, often with their bare hands, to free the heavy, delicate artifacts, which were then painstakingly hoisted to the surface. The operation was a constant battle against the elements and the limits of human endurance. And it came at a terrible cost. The perilous conditions claimed a life. One diver, Georgios Kritikos, died from decompression sickness. Two others, including the first man to see the wreck, Elias Stadiatos, were left permanently paralyzed from the effects of the deep dives. But what they brought to the surface was a treasure trove that stunned the world and rewrote the history of ancient art. Piece by piece, the lost cargo of the ancient Roman-era ship was brought into the light of the 20th century. There were magnificent, world-class bronze statues, including the famous Antikythera Youth, a masterpiece of Greek art from the 4th century BCE. There were beautifully crafted and hauntingly lifelike marble sculptures. There was a wealth of elegant glassware, ornate pieces of pottery, and golden jewelry. It was one of the richest and most important collections of ancient Greek treasure ever found, all recovered from a single, sunken vessel. Based on the style of the artifacts, particularly the pottery and the coins found at the site, archaeologists were able to confidently date the shipwreck. They determined that the vessel was a large Roman cargo ship, a superfreighter of its day, that had gone down sometime in the 1st century BCE, with the most likely date being around 70 to 60 BCE. The cargo's origin was clearly the Greek East. The ship was probably sailing from one of the wealthy cultural centers of the Hellenistic world, perhaps from the wealthy cities of Pergamon or Ephesus on the coast of Asia Minor, or, as later evidence would suggest, the island of Rhodes. Its destination was almost certainly Rome. It was likely carrying spoils of war or a collection of plundered Greek art for a wealthy Roman nobleman, or even for a grand triumphal parade for a victorious general like Pompey the Great or Julius Caesar. The ship, like the sponge diver's vessel 2,000 years later, had likely been caught in a sudden storm in the treacherous Antikythera Strait, foundered, and sank to the bottom of the sea, its precious cargo lost to the world. The recovered treasures were carefully transported to the National Archaeological Museum in Athens for the long and painstaking process of cleaning, preservation, and study. And it was here, amidst the celebrated, beautiful statues and the elegant pottery, that our central mystery truly begins. Among the priceless artifacts brought up from the deep was a strange, unassuming, and frankly, ugly object. It was a misshapen lump of bronze, about the size of a large book or a modern laptop computer. It was so heavily corroded and encrusted with marine growth and calcified sediment that its original form was almost completely unrecognizable. It had clearly been housed in a wooden case at one time, but the wood had long since rotted away in the sea, leaving only the hard, rocky mass of the mechanism inside. It had broken into 3 main pieces and dozens of smaller fragments. Compared to the breathtaking beauty of the bronze statues with which it was found, this lump of metal was of little interest to most. It was catalogued and put into storage at the museum, largely ignored by the art historians who were focused on the magnificent sculptures. It was considered just another piece of wreckage, perhaps a part of the ship's navigation equipment, a broken piece of a small statue, or even a rock. For decades, it sat there on a shelf in the museum storeroom, a silent, corroded, and forgotten enigma, its extraordinary and world-changing secret locked deep inside. The first faint hint that this was no ordinary piece of bronze came in May of 1902, just a year after its recovery. An archaeologist and chemist named Valerio Staes was meticulously examining all the finds from the wreck. He picked up one of the pieces of the corroded lump, and he noticed that it had recently broken apart, likely due to the change in environment from the high-pressure, wet conditions of the deep sea to the dry air of the museum's storeroom. And in the fresh, clean break, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. Embedded within the corroded mass, like a fossil in a rock, was the unmistakable, perfectly formed outline of a gear wheel. He could clearly see precisely cut, triangular teeth on a small bronze wheel, a gear that was only about an inch in diameter. Staes was utterly baffled. The presence of a complex, precision-made gear wheel, as part of what appeared to be an intricate mechanism, in an object that was definitively dated to the 1st century BCE was, according to the entire known and accepted history of technology, completely and totally impossible. Gearing technology was, of course, known to the ancient Greeks. They used simple, large gears in things like water mills to grind grain, and in lifting devices like cranes. But this was different. This looked like part of an intricate, interlocking system of much smaller, more precise gears, something far more complex than a simple water wheel. It looked like part of a clockwork mechanism. But complex, precision gear trains like this were not supposed to have been invented for another 1,500 years. The history books were clear and unambiguous on this point. The first known devices of this complexity were the great, room-sized astronomical clocks that were built for the cathedrals of medieval Europe in the 14th century. Staes, a man of science, published his observation, suggesting that the object might be some kind of astronomical clock or navigational instrument. But his groundbreaking idea was met not with excitement, but with ridicule and outright dismissal from the wider academic community. The leading experts of the day simply could not accept it. The idea was too radical, too disruptive to their entire understanding of the ancient world. They believed he must have been mistaken. They argued that the object must be a much later device, perhaps from a Byzantine or even a Renaissance clock, that had somehow fallen onto the ancient shipwreck site by coincidence. Others argued that what he saw wasn't a gear at all, but a piece of a military catapult or some other known object that he was misinterpreting. The idea of such an advanced piece of technology existing in the age of Julius Caesar was simply too much to contemplate. It was an anachronism, a piece of technology that was completely out of time. The consensus was that it couldn't be what it appeared to be, and so, for another 50 years, the strange bronze lump was once again largely ignored, relegated to the status of an unimportant, unexplainable, and baffling curiosity. It wasn't until the 1950s that the object began to receive serious scholarly attention again, thanks to the tireless work of a British science historian at Yale University named Derek de Solla Price. Price became obsessed with the object. He was convinced that it was an authentic ancient artifact and that it held a profound secret about the true level of Greek technology. He spent 2 decades traveling back and forth to Athens, studying the corroded fragments with a passion that bordered on obsession. In 1974, after years of painstaking research, using the best technology available at the time, conventional X-rays and gamma rays, to peer inside the fragment, she published a landmark paper in the prestigious journal Scientific American. In his paper, he confirmed Stace's initial suspicion and went much, much further. He had been able to identify a complex system of differential gearing within the mechanism, a sophisticated arrangement of gears that allows for the addition or subtraction of 2 different rotations. This was a technology that was previously thought to have been invented by the great clockmakers of the 16th century for use in astronomical clocks. Price concluded, definitively, that the device was indeed an ancient astronomical calculator, a machine designed to model the complex movements of the heavens. Price's work was groundbreaking and revolutionary. It forced the academic world to finally take the object seriously. But his research was still incomplete. The X-ray technology he had available could only reveal so much. The mechanism was still in 82 separate, heavily corroded fragments. Many of the gears were fused together in a solid mass, their delicate teeth completely obscured by the layers of corrosion. He could see the general layout, but he couldn't see every single gear. He couldn't count every single tooth. He could not fully reconstruct how the entire machine worked. He could only guess at its full capabilities, its full genius. The world now knew that the Antikythera mechanism was an object of almost unbelievable sophistication, a lonely testament to a lost branch of ancient Greek technology. But its full story, the true extent of its brilliance, remained a frustrating puzzle, with most of its pieces still missing or locked away inside the corroded bronze. This was the immense and tantalizing challenge that faced the next generation of researchers. How do you study an object that is too fragile to be taken apart? How do you count the teeth on a gear that is hidden deep inside a fused lump of metal? How do you read the inscriptions that are buried under 2 millennia of marine incrustation? A full and complete understanding of the Antikythera mechanism would have to wait for the dawn of a new century, for the development of advanced, 21st-century imaging technology that could, for the very first time, allow scientists to virtually dissect the object without ever touching it, and to finally, after a century of mystery, unlock the secrets that had been resting in the silent deep for 2,000 years. The stage was now set for the final revelation, a moment when modern science would pull back the curtain on ancient genius and reveal a device more complex, more sophisticated, and more brilliant than anyone had ever dared to imagine. For the better part of a century, the Antikythera mechanism was a profound and tantalizing paradox. It was an object that, according to our understanding of history, simply should not exist. The pioneering work of researchers like Derek de Solla Price had confirmed that this corroded lump of bronze was not a simple tool or a piece of a statue, but was, in fact, an incredibly complex geared machine from the ancient world. They had caught glimpses of its inner workings, identifying gear trains and differential systems that were 1,000 years ahead of their time. But these were just glimpses. The full picture remained shrouded in mystery, locked away within the 82 calcified, fragile fragments that were all that remained of the original device. The mechanism was a puzzle box, and the key to opening it had been lost to time. To move forward, to truly understand its function and its genius, would require a technological leap, a new way of seeing that could peer through solid metal and read the ghost inscriptions left behind by its creators. That moment finally arrived at the dawn of the 21st century. In the early 2000s, a new, international, and interdisciplinary team was formed, known as the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project. This team brought together archaeologists, astronomers, historians, and most crucially, experts in advanced imaging technology from companies like Hewlett-Packard and X-Tech Systems. Their mission was to apply the most cutting-edge tools of modern science to this ancient mystery, to finally and definitively decode the secrets of the Antikythera mechanism. For the first time, the fragile fragments were carefully transported from their home in the Athens Museum to a specialized lab where they would be subjected to an unprecedented level of analysis. The central challenge remained the same: how to see inside the fused, corroded fragments without destroying them. The answer came in the form of high-resolution X-ray computed tomography, or CT scanning. This is the same basic technology used in modern medicine to create three-dimensional images of the inside of the human body, but the machine they used was a massive, custom-built, 8-ton device designed for industrial applications. It was powerful enough to blast X-rays through the dense, corroded bronze. Over a period of several weeks, the scientists meticulously scanned each of the 82 fragments, taking thousands of high-resolution X-ray slices. These slices were then fed into powerful computers that used sophisticated algorithms to reconstruct a complete, three-dimensional virtual model of the entire mechanism. For the first time, the researchers could fly through the device in virtual space. They could see every gear, every axle, every pin in its precise location. They could digitally peel away the layers of corrosion and see the hidden, internal structures that had been invisible for 2,000 years. But they didn't stop there. They also employed another revolutionary imaging technique called polynomial texture mapping, or PTM. This technique involves taking hundreds of digital photographs of an object surface, each one with the light source coming from a different angle. A computer then combines these images to create a virtual surface that can be manipulated and lit from any direction on a computer screen. This proved to be the key to reading the almost invisible inscriptions on the device's dials and casing. Letters and symbols that were completely illegible to the naked eye, worn away by centuries of immersion in the sea, suddenly popped into view when the virtual light was raked across the surface at a sharp angle. It was like a form of digital archaeology, uncovering lost text that was thought to be gone forever. As the data from these scans poured in and the virtual model took shape, the team was left in a state of collective awe. The reality of the device was even more astonishing than anyone had previously imagined. The scans revealed a stunningly complex and elegant system of at least 30, and possibly more, interlocking bronze gears, all housed within a compact wooden and bronze case about the size of a shoebox. The gears were not crudely made. They were precisely engineered, with small, triangular teeth cut with a remarkable degree of accuracy. The entire machine was a masterpiece of miniature mechanical engineering, a level of craftsmanship that was simply without precedent in the ancient world. And as they deciphered the inscriptions and traced the movements of the gears, the true, breathtaking purpose of the device became clear. The Antikythera mechanism was not just a simple clock or a basic calendar. It was a sophisticated, hand-powered, portable analog computer. It was a mechanical calculator of the cosmos. By turning a single hand crank, which was likely attached to the side of the box, the user could set the machine to any specific date, past, present, or future. And as the crank turned, the intricate system of gears would whir into life, driving a series of pointers on multiple dials on the front and back of the device, all moving at different, carefully calculated speeds. These dials would then display a wealth of astronomical information with incredible precision. The front face of the device was its main display, a celestial dashboard that showed the user the state of the heavens on any given day. There were at least two concentric dials here. The outer dial was a 365-day Egyptian solar calendar, which was the standard scientific calendar of the Hellenistic world because it was simple and didn't require messy leap years. Inside this was another dial marked with the 12 signs of the Greek zodiac. A long pointer, representing the sun, would move around this dial, indicating the sun's position in the zodiac throughout the year. A second, separate pointer showed the position of the moon. But this lunar pointer did not move at a simple, constant speed. In a display of breathtaking mechanical genius, it incorporated what astronomers call the first anomaly of the moon's motion. The ancient Greeks knew from careful observation that the moon appears to speed up and slow down in its journey across the sky due to its elliptical orbit around the Earth. The mechanism modeled this variable motion using a brilliant system of epicyclic gearing, a smaller gear riding on the edge of a larger one, a technique that was previously thought to have been invented by the great clockmakers of the Renaissance. The mechanism even had a small, rotating silver and black sphere attached to the moon pointer, which would turn to show the current phase of the moon new, first quarter, full, and last quarter. But that wasn't all. The researchers now believe there were also pointers for the 5 planets that were known to the ancient Greeks: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Modeling the apparent motion of the planets is an even more difficult task than modeling the moon, as they exhibit retrograde motion, appearing to stop, move backward, and then move forward again in the sky as the Earth overtakes them in its orbit. The latest reconstruction suggests that the ancient Greek engineers solved this problem with an incredibly complex and ingenious system of nested gear trains, a level of mechanical sophistication that was almost unthinkable for the period. The front dial was, in essence, a complete planetarium, a dynamic map of the solar system as they understood it, showing the precise position of the sun, the moon, and the 5 visible planets against the backdrop of the zodiac for any date you chose. If the front of the device was a marvel, the back was where its true predictive power was revealed. The back face was dominated by 2 large and beautiful spiral dials, which looked almost like snail shells. These dials were not for tracking positions. They were for predicting events and cycles over long periods of time. The upper spiral dial was a display for the Metonic cycle. The ancient Greeks, like many cultures, used a lunar calendar for their religious festivals, but a solar calendar for agriculture and civil life. The problem is that these 2 calendars don't match up neatly. A solar year is about 11 days longer than 12 lunar months. The Metonic cycle, discovered by the Greek astronomer Meton of Athens, was a brilliant solution to this problem. It is a 19-year cycle, or 235 lunar months, at the end of which the phases of the moon will once again fall on the same dates of the solar year. It was the master calendar, the key to reconciling the sun and the moon. The upper spiral dial on the mechanism had 235 divisions along its 5-turn spiral track. A pointer would move along this track, allowing the user to know exactly where they were in this 19-year cycle, essential for planning religious festivals and managing the civil calendar. The lower spiral dial was perhaps the most impressive feature of the entire machine. This dial was a dedicated eclipse predictor. It tracked a complex astronomical cycle known as the Saros cycle. Ancient astronomers, likely the Babylonians first, had discovered that the complex geometries of the sun, earth, and moon that produce eclipses repeat in a predictable pattern approximately every 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours. This is the Saros cycle. The lower dial on the Antikythera mechanism had 223 divisions along its 4-turn spiral, corresponding to the 223 lunar months in one Saros cycle. A pointer would move along this dial, and at certain positions, small inscriptions, now readable thanks to the new scanning technology, would indicate a predicted eclipse. The level of detail was astonishing. The inscriptions would note whether the eclipse was predicted to be solar, sigma for Selene, the moon, or lunar, eta for Helios, the sun. They even seemed to include notes on the predicted color and characteristics of the eclipse, information that was likely used for astrological divination. The device was not just a scientific instrument, it was also a tool for understanding the omens and messages of the heavens. An eclipse was a powerful and often terrifying event in the ancient world, seen as a portent of war, famine, or the death of kings. To be able to predict such an event, to know when the sun would go dark or the moon would turn to blood, would have been a source of immense knowledge and power. The device even tracked another, smaller cycle called the exoligmos cycle, which is a period of 3 Saros cycles, about 54 years, which was needed to more accurately predict the timing of eclipses from a specific location. When we assemble all of these functions, the true nature of the Antikythera mechanism is revealed. It was a complete, portable, mechanical model of the cosmos as it was understood by the most brilliant minds of the Hellenistic Greek world. It was a philosophical instrument, a teaching tool, and a powerful predictive computer, all housed in a small wooden box. It took the most advanced and complex astronomical theories of the day, the solar year, the lunar month, the variable motion of the moon, the retrograde motion of the planets, the 19-year Metonic cycle, the 18-year Saros eclipse cycle, and translated all of them into the silent, precise, and beautiful language of interlocking bronze gears. The level of genius required to accomplish this is staggering. It required, first, a deep and sophisticated understanding of astronomy and mathematics. The creator had to know not just the cycles themselves, but the precise numerical ratios needed to model them. But it also required a second, completely different kind of genius, a mastery of mechanical engineering. The designer had to be able to envision how these abstract mathematical ratios could be embodied in physical gears with specific tooth counts. They had to figure out how to arrange dozens of gears on multiple layers, all turning on different axes and at different speeds, all driven by a single input, without jamming or slipping. It required a level of conceptual design and precision manufacturing that historians simply did not believe the ancient Greeks possessed. We knew they had great philosophers like Plato and Aristotle and brilliant mathematicians like Euclid and Archimedes. But we did not know they also had master engineers capable of building what was, in essence, the world's first analog computer. The scientific revelation of what this device could do was complete. It was an object more complex and more sophisticated than any other known machine for the next 1.5 millennia. The mystery was no longer what it was, but who on earth could have possibly built it, and why this incredible technology was completely lost to the pages of history. The scientific revelations delivered by 21st century technology were nothing short of breathtaking. After a century of speculation, the world finally knew what the Antikythera mechanism was. It was an ancient Greek analog computer of staggering complexity, a portable cosmos in a box, a device that could predict the movements of the sun, the moon, the planets, and even foretell terrifying celestial events like eclipses. The scientific what of the mystery had been solved. But this solution only opened the door to an even more profound and personal historical mystery. Who on earth, 2,000 years ago, possessed the unique combination of astronomical genius and mechanical mastery to conceive of and construct such a thing? This question launches us on a new kind of investigation, a journey of historical detective work. We must now sift through the clues left behind by the shipwreck itself, examine the surviving inscriptions on the device, and delve into the writings of ancient authors, all in an attempt to identify the time, the place, and perhaps even the very workshop where this masterpiece was born. The search for the creator of the Antikythera mechanism is a quest to put a human face on this act of anonymous genius, to trace the device back to a lost world of Hellenistic science and engineering that was far more advanced than we ever dared to imagine. Our investigation begins with the most tangible piece of evidence we have: the shipwreck itself. The context in which an artifact is found is crucial. The other items in the ship's cargo act as silent witnesses, providing clues about the vessel's origin, its destination, and its final, fateful voyage. The Antikythera wreck was a treasure trove of luxury goods. The magnificent bronze and marble statues, the fine pottery, the elegant glassware, all of these items point to a specific cultural and geographical origin. They are overwhelmingly Greek, created during the Hellenistic period, the era after Alexander the Great when Greek culture and science flourished across the eastern Mediterranean. The style of the amphory, the large pottery jars used for transport, has allowed archaeologists to pinpoint the ship's origin even more precisely. Many of them come from the island of Rhodes or from cities on the coast of Asia Minor, like Pergamon and Ephesus. The likely destination of the ship was Rome. In the 1st century BCE, Rome was the new superpower of the Mediterranean, its wealthy generals and senators eagerly importing Greek art and culture to adorn their villas and to display their sophistication. The cargo of the Antikythera ship fits this pattern perfectly. It was almost certainly a Roman vessel, laden with plundered or purchased Greek treasures, making its way west. It was perhaps part of the spoils of war from one of Rome's many campaigns in the east, a collection of masterpieces destined for a triumphal parade for a victorious general. This context is vital. It tells us that the mechanism was not a Roman invention. It was a Greek one. It was created somewhere in the vibrant, intellectually sophisticated Greek world of the Eastern Mediterranean, and it was on its way to Rome as either a piece of valuable loot or a commissioned luxury item when the ship met its doom. Based on the dating of the other artifacts, the shipwreck occurred sometime between 70 and 60 BCE. The mechanism itself, however, is likely a few decades older, probably constructed sometime in the late 2nd or early 1st century BCE, around 150 to 100 BCE. Our search, therefore, is for a Greek workshop, active in a major center of learning around this specific time, capable of producing such an extraordinary device. The inscriptions on the mechanism itself provide our next set of crucial clues. Thanks to the advanced imaging techniques, scholars have been able to read thousands of characters of previously invisible Greek text on the device's casing and dials. This text is essentially the device's user manual. It explains what the various dials show and how to interpret them. The style of the Greek lettering has allowed experts to date the device's construction with even more confidence, confirming the mid to late 2nd century BCE as the most likely period of its creation. But the inscriptions do more than just provide a date. The names of the months used on one of the calendars are of a Corinthian type, used in several Greek colonies. One of those colonies was Syracuse in Sicily, the home of the legendary Archimedes. But another prominent location where this calendar was used was the island of Rhodes, which brings us back to the evidence from the shipwreck's cargo. The convergence of evidence begins to point strongly towards a single, famous location. In the 2nd century BCE, the island of Rhodes was not just a beautiful tourist destination, it was a major commercial hub and one of the preeminent centers of science and learning in the entire Hellenistic world. It was particularly famous for its school of astronomy and mathematics. And at the very heart of this school was a man who is widely considered to be the single greatest astronomer of antiquity, a genius whose work would dominate the field for the next 1,500 years, Hipparchus of Rhodes. Hipparchus was a brilliant and meticulous observer of the heavens. He compiled the first comprehensive star catalogue, he accurately calculated the length of the year, he discovered the precession of the equinoxes, and he is credited with being the father of trigonometry. He was a man obsessed with precision and with creating mathematical models that could accurately predict the movements of the celestial bodies. And it is in the specific, advanced astronomical theories encoded within the Antikythera mechanism that we find the fingerprints of Hipparchus's genius all over the device. The most compelling piece of evidence is the mechanism's incredibly sophisticated modeling of the moon's motion. As we know, the device doesn't just show the moon moving at a constant speed. It accounts for its first anomaly, the fact that it speeds up and slows down because of its elliptical orbit. This complex theory of the moon's variable motion was one of Hipparchus's greatest and most famous contributions to astronomy. The fact that this specific, advanced theory is mathematically and mechanically embodied in the device's gear train is a powerful link. It strongly suggests that the creator of the mechanism was either Hipparchus himself or someone from his immediate circle, a student or a colleague working at the school on Rhodes who had direct access to his latest cutting-edge research. Furthermore, the inscriptions on the device's eclipse predicting dial mention specific dates for astronomical events. When researchers have cross-referenced these dates with modern astronomical software, they have found that the predictions would have been most accurate if the observer was located at a latitude of around 35 degrees north. The city of Rhodes lies almost exactly at this latitude. The evidence becomes almost overwhelming. The ship's cargo points to Rhodes. The calendar on the device could have been used in Rhodes. The astronomical theories it embodies are those of Hipparchus of Rhodes, and its predictions work best from the latitude of Rhodes. It seems almost certain that the Antikythera mechanism was designed and built on the island of Rhodes, sometime in the late 2nd century BCE, by someone deeply connected to the work of the great Hipparchus. But this raises another fascinating question. Was the Antikythera mechanism a completely unique, one-of-a-kind invention, a singular flash of genius that appeared and then vanished? Or was it part of a wider, now-lost tradition of building such complex mechanical devices? For the answer to this, we must turn to the writings of the great Roman statesman, orator, and philosopher, Marcus Tullius Cicero. Cicero, writing in the 1st century BC, the exact same time the Antikythera ship was sailing, describes a fascinating conversation he witnessed. In his work De Republica on the Republic, he recounts a story about 2 extraordinary mechanical devices that had been brought to Rome. These devices, he writes, were constructed by the legendary Greek mathematician, physicist, and inventor Archimedes of Syracuse, more than a century earlier, in the 3rd century BC. Archimedes was perhaps the most brilliant scientific mind of the ancient world, famous for his work on geometry, his inventions of war machines, and his fabled Eureka moment in the bath. Cicero describes 2 such machines. One was a solid, celestial globe that mapped the constellations. The other, far more impressive, was a mechanical sphere, a planetarium, that, when turned, demonstrated the movements of the sun, the moon, and the 5 planets. Cicero writes with awe that this single device could replicate the different speeds and motions of the celestial bodies, and could even show the phases of the moon and predict solar and lunar eclipses. Cicero's description of Archimedes' machine sounds almost exactly like a description of the Antikythera mechanism. It performs the same functions and demonstrates the same astonishing level of mechanical complexity. Cicero was not a scientist, and his description is not technical, but the conceptual parallel is unmistakable. This ancient text is a crucial piece of the puzzle. It tells us that the Antikythera mechanism was not a singular anomaly. It suggests that there was a known, established tradition of building these complex astronomical computers in the Hellenistic world, a tradition that was pioneered by the supreme genius of Archimedes a full century before the Antikythera device was even built. This suddenly changes our entire perspective. The Antikythera mechanism is no longer an isolated miracle. It is a survivor. It is likely the only surviving example of what may have been a whole class of similar devices, a family of Hellenistic auroras or planetaria that were known and celebrated in the ancient world. The knowledge of how to build these machines was likely passed down from the school of Archimedes in Syracuse to later centers of learning, like the school of Hipparchus in Rhodes. The Antikythera mechanism is, in this light, the magnificent descendant of Archimedes' original invention, a later, perhaps more refined, model built upon a century of accumulated knowledge and engineering expertise. This then leads us to the final and most tragic part of the story. If these incredible devices existed, why were they all lost? Why is the Antikythera mechanism the only one we have? The answer, most likely, lies in the material from which they were made, bronze. Bronze was an incredibly valuable and strategic metal in the ancient world. It was used for weapons, for armor, for coinage, and for statues. When empires fell and cities were sacked, bronze objects were among the first things to be looted and melted down. A complex mechanical computer, no matter how brilliant, would have been seen by a conquering soldier not as a masterpiece of science, but as a heavy lump of valuable metal, ready to be melted into swords or coins. It is almost certain that many other such devices existed throughout the Hellenistic and Roman worlds, but over the centuries of war and collapse that followed, they were all destroyed, their precious bronze recycled, their genius melted away into nothing. The survival of the Antikythera mechanism is, therefore, a miracle of pure chance. It survived precisely because it was lost. The violent storm that sank the Roman cargo ship off the coast of Antikythera was a tragedy for the crew, but it was an act of historical preservation for the mechanism. By sinking to the bottom of the sea, it was placed in a time capsule, hidden from the destructive march of human history from the collapsing empires, the barbarian invasions, and the scrap metal drives of the ages. It lay in the silent deep for 2 millennia, a single, lonely survivor of a lost world of technology, waiting patiently for a chance encounter with another storm and another group of sailors to bring its story back into the light. The discovery of the Antikythera mechanism and the deciphering of its purpose give us a tantalizing and ultimately humbling glimpse into this lost world. It forces us to reconsider our entire timeline of technological progress. The standard narrative of history is one of a long, dark age of lost knowledge after the fall of Rome, a period where sophisticated science and engineering vanished, only to be slowly and painfully rediscovered during the Renaissance. But the Antikythera mechanism tells a different story. It tells us that the rebirth of the Renaissance was, in many ways, just a re-remembering of knowledge that the ancient Greeks had already possessed. They had already built computers. They had already mastered complex gearing. They had a level of mechanical sophistication that was not matched, let alone surpassed, for 1,500 years. The creator of the Antikythera mechanism, whether it was Hipparchus himself or a master craftsman in his workshop on Rhodes, remains anonymous. No signature was ever found on the device. But in a way, the creator's identity is less important than the legacy they left behind. They were part of a brilliant tradition, a lineage of genius stretching back to Archimedes, a tradition that saw no barrier between theoretical astronomy and practical, mechanical engineering. They were philosopher-engineers who sought not just to understand the cosmos, but to replicate it in miniature, to hold its beautiful, predictable motions in the palm of their hand. The Antikythera mechanism is their silent, corroded, and utterly magnificent testament, a single, precious survivor that challenges our assumptions and stands as a permanent monument to a forgotten world of ancient Greek genius. Our journey in pursuit of the Antikythera mechanism has led us from the bottom of the Aegean Sea to the cutting edge of 21st century science, and from there back in time to the brilliant, sunlit workshops of ancient Rhodes. We have pieced together the story of its discovery. We have marveled at the scientific revelations that unveiled its true purpose as an astronomical computer, and we have followed the historical clues that connect it to the legendary minds of Archimedes and Hipparchus. In many ways, the central mystery of what the device was and who likely built it has been solved. We have a clear and compelling picture of a masterpiece of Hellenistic science and engineering. But solving one set of mysteries has only given birth to another, deeper and perhaps even more profound, set of unanswered questions. The Antikythera mechanism is not just a solution, it is a profound and unsettling enigma. Its very existence, this single, corroded survivor from a lost world, acts like a historical black hole, warping our entire understanding of the past and forcing us to confront a series of challenging and humbling questions. These are questions that go beyond simple mechanics and astronomy, questions that touch upon the very nature of technological progress, the fragility of human knowledge, and the vast, dark spaces in our historical record. This is the final and most mysterious chapter of our investigation, the lasting enigma of the Antikythera computer. The first and most immediate of these lingering questions is a practical one, but no less baffling for it. Even now that we understand what the mechanism does and how its gears fit together, we still do not fully understand how it was made. The level of precision craftsmanship on display in the mechanism is, simply put, astonishing. Modern analysis of the gear teeth shows that they were cut with a remarkable degree of accuracy and uniformity. The gear train, with its multiple layers and complex interactions, would have required an incredibly precise assembly. The slightest error in the cutting of a single tooth or the drilling of a single axle hole would have thrown off the calculations, causing the entire machine to jam or produce inaccurate results. How did ancient Greek artisans, working 2,000 years before the invention of modern machine tools, achieve this level of precision? We have no surviving texts from the period that describe the tools or techniques used to create such a device. There are no handbooks for the Hellenistic mechanical engineer. We are left to speculate based on the evidence of the object itself. The gear teeth are almost perfect equilateral triangles, suggesting they were laid out with a compass and a ruler, the fundamental tools of Greek geometry. But how were they cut from the solid bronze? Were they painstakingly filed by hand, a process that would have required superhuman patience and a level of skill that is almost impossible to imagine? Or did the ancient Greeks possess more sophisticated tools than we give them credit for? Did they have some form of precision lathe or a gear-cutting tool that has been completely lost to history? We simply do not know. The challenge of creating the mechanism was not just in the making of the individual parts, but in the embodiment of the abstract mathematical concepts. The designer had to translate complex astronomical ratios, like the 235:19 ratio of the Metonic cycle, into a physical system of interlocking gears with specific tooth counts. This required not only a brilliant understanding of mathematics, but also a practical, intuitive grasp of mechanical engineering. It was a fusion of the theoretical and the practical, the mind of the philosopher and the hand of the craftsman, that we simply did not believe was possible in the ancient world. The how of the Antikythera mechanism's construction remains a profound mystery, a testament to a level of lost artisanal knowledge that we may never fully recover. This leads us to the second, and by far the biggest and most important mystery of all. If the ancient Greeks possessed the knowledge and the skill to build a device as sophisticated as the Antikythera mechanism in the 2nd century BCE, why did this incredible technology completely disappear? Why did it leave no discernible legacy? Why did the world have to wait another 1,500 years for clockmakers in medieval Europe to independently reinvent and build anything of comparable mechanical complexity? This is the great enigma of the Antikythera mechanism, the mystery of the lost technology. The conventional view of Western history is a simple, linear narrative of progress. We see a line that goes from the scientific heights of the Greek and Roman world through a long, dark valley of intellectual stagnation and collapse after the fall of Rome, the so-called Dark Ages, and then a slow, steady climb back upwards, culminating in the scientific rebirth of the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution. The Antikythera mechanism shatters this simple, comforting narrative. It shows us that history is not a straight line. It is a messy, unpredictable story of peaks and valleys, of brilliant discoveries that can be made, celebrated, and then completely and utterly lost. So what happened? Why was this technological tradition broken? There are several competing theories, none of which are mutually exclusive. The first theory points to the rise of the Roman Empire. The Greeks, particularly during the Hellenistic period, had a profound love for theoretical science, for abstract mathematics and philosophical inquiry. They sought to understand the cosmos for the sake of understanding it. The Romans, by contrast, were brilliant and pragmatic engineers, but their genius was of a different kind. They were interested in the practical application of technology. They built magnificent roads, towering aqueducts, and massive amphitheaters. They were masters of civil engineering, of concrete, of the arch. But they were, generally speaking, less interested in the kind of abstract, theoretical science that would have produced the Antikythera mechanism. It is possible that as Roman culture and priorities came to dominate the Mediterranean world, the specific intellectual ecosystem that had nurtured the creation of such devices began to wither. The funding, the patronage, and the cultural value placed on building complex philosophical instruments may have declined in favor of more practical, large-scale engineering projects. The tradition did not vanish overnight, but it may have slowly faded away as the Roman world's focus shifted from theoretical models of the cosmos to the practical administration of a vast empire. A second, more catastrophic theory blames the simple, brutal reality of historical collapse. The tradition of building these devices may have survived well into the Roman period, but it would have been a highly specialized knowledge, held by only a small number of master craftsmen and workshops. This kind of fragile, complex knowledge is incredibly vulnerable. All it would take is the destruction of a few key libraries, the burning of a few key workshops, or the death of a handful of masters without their having passed on their skills, for the entire tradition to be extinguished. The centuries that followed the peak of the Hellenistic era were filled with war, invasions, and social upheaval. The burning of the Library of Alexandria is the most famous symbol of this loss of knowledge, but similar acts of destruction occurred all over the Mediterranean world. In the chaos of the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, in the fires and the sacks of cities, it is all too easy to imagine how this delicate stream of technological genius could have been permanently broken, its secrets lost in the ashes. A third theory suggests a shift in the very way people thought about the world. The Hellenistic approach that produced the mechanism was fundamentally rational and mathematical. It was an attempt to understand the universe as a predictable, clockwork machine, a cosmos governed by discoverable laws and ratios. The rise of new religious and mystical belief systems in the later Roman Empire, including Christianity, brought with it a different worldview. The focus shifted from understanding the mechanical workings of the cosmos to the spiritual relationship between the individual soul and a transcendent God. Perhaps the motivation to build complex mechanical models of the heavens simply faded away as the cultural and spiritual priorities of society changed. The quest to understand the mind of God shifted from the language of gears and ratios to the language of faith and revelation. Whatever the reason, a shift in cultural priorities, the destruction of war, or a change in worldview, the result was the same. An entire branch of advanced technology was cut from the tree of human knowledge. It did not evolve. It did not lead to the next logical invention. It simply died. The world had to start over, spending the next millennium and a half slowly and painstakingly rediscovering the principles of mechanics and gearing that the ancient Greeks had already mastered. The Antikythera mechanism is a ghost from this alternate timeline, a glimpse of a scientific future that never happened. It makes us wonder what our world would look like today if this technological tradition had not been lost. If Greek engineers had continued to build upon this knowledge, what other machines might they have created by the year 500 AD or 1000 AD? It is one of history's most profound and unanswerable what-ifs. This leads us to our third and equally humbling unanswered question. What else have we lost? The Antikythera mechanism survived by pure, dumb luck. It was a priceless object on a ship that happened to sink in a specific location, and it lay there undisturbed until another ship happened to take shelter from a storm in the exact same spot 2,000 years later. The odds of its survival and discovery are astronomically small. Its existence is a statistical miracle. And this forces us to confront a deeply unsettling thought. If this one impossible object survived by chance, how many other incredible inventions and astonishing technologies existed in the ancient world that did not? How many other brilliant devices, made of valuable bronze, were melted down for scrap? How many unique machines, made of perishable wood or iron, have simply rotted away to nothing? The Antikythera mechanism proves that our understanding of the past, which is based only on the tiny fraction of evidence that has managed to survive, is fundamentally and profoundly incomplete. We are like archaeologists trying to reconstruct an entire ecosystem from a single, fossilized bone. The mechanism is a stark and powerful reminder that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because we haven't found any other ancient computers doesn't mean they didn't exist. On the contrary, the sheer sophistication of the Antikythera mechanism strongly implies that it was not a prototype. It is too polished, too complex, too refined. It is clearly the product of a mature and established tradition, a tradition of which we have now lost every single other example. It makes us wonder what other impossible technologies are still out there, waiting to be discovered at the bottom of the sea or buried deep beneath the earth of a forgotten city. Discoveries that could once again completely upend our neat and tidy timelines of the past. This brings us to our final point of reflection, the ultimate and lasting enigma of the Antikythera mechanism. It is a discovery that forces us to completely redefine our perception of ancient genius. For centuries, we have held the ancient Greeks in high esteem. We knew they were brilliant philosophers who gave us Plato and Aristotle. We knew they were profound political thinkers who gave us the concept of democracy. We knew they were master artists who gave us the Parthenon and the breathtaking statues found on the Antikythera wreck itself. We knew they were brilliant mathematicians and geometers who gave us Euclid and Pythagoras. But we did not know this. We did not know that they were also master mechanical engineers, capable of building intricate machines that could rightly be called computers. The Antikythera mechanism bridges a gap we never knew existed. It connects the abstract, theoretical world of Greek philosophy and astronomy with the practical, hands-on world of the workshop and the artisan. It shows us that the same culture that produced the philosophical dialogues of Socrates also produced a class of philosopher-engineers, individuals who could not only contemplate the abstract order of the cosmos, but could also build a working, physical model of it. This discovery is, in many ways, deeply humbling. It shatters our modern arrogance, our quiet assumption that we are the pinnacle of a long, uninterrupted line of progress. It shows us that the capacity for a certain kind of complex, scientific, and mechanical genius is not a modern invention. It is an ancient one. The Antikythera mechanism is, therefore, more than just a fascinating scientific curiosity or a valuable archaeological artifact. It is a monument to a lost stream of human ingenuity. It is a powerful reminder that history is not a simple story, but a complex and often broken one. It challenges us to be more humble in our assumptions about the past and more curious about what secrets may still lie hidden. It is a single, corroded object that has rewritten 1,000 textbooks. And even now, after more than a century of study, it has not given up all of its secrets. It remains an enigma, a beautiful and complex ghost from a world we are only just beginning to understand. It is a silent, geared testament to the profound and humbling truth that the past is not always what it seems, and that it is full of incredible, breathtaking surprises. The Antikythera mechanism is more than just an artifact. It is a message in a bottle, a whisper from a lost world of genius. It tells us that our ancestors were not primitive, but were capable of a technological sophistication we are only just beginning to understand. It is a humbling reminder that history is not a straight line of progress, and that brilliant ideas can be discovered, celebrated, and then completely forgotten, waiting 2 millennia in the silent deep to be found again. Thanks for exploring with Ancient Relics Keeper. What mystery should we unravel next? Like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Let's keep digging into history's secrets together.